Our next speaker is going to be Jonathan Park. Jonathan is a graduate student HDFS working with Dr. Seaman Chow and Peter Molinar. And today, Jonathan will be presenting some of his work on emotion dynamics in individuals with major depressive disorder. So Jonathan, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you for the introduction, Chelsea, and thank you everyone for having me and coming to this talk. So yeah, I'm talking about emotion dynamics in individuals with MDD, as well as their pair-matched controls. So just some general goals for my talk. I want to frame MDD from a network perspective and set up some kind of expectations that we have given past literature. I'm going to introduce this fancy algorithm that we have just for a couple slides because we made it and we're impressed by it. And then I'll talk about kind of like the bulk results of this study that we conducted, looking at individuals with MDD, their pair matched controls from a top down as well as from a data-driven perspective. So the network perspective of psychopathology, I'm sure many of us are familiar with it, but essentially instead of conceptualizing psychopathologies, say like depression is this thing that I have inside me that causes common changes and fluctuations and things like anhedonia, mood, fatigue, etc. The network perspective posits that psychopathologies are instead this emergent property of the dynamics of a network, right? So instead of looking at depression as this unmeasurable latent factor, it is the actual symptoms and how they interact with one another, both within time and across people. And so kind of the network perspective has seen a lot of use in recent years, particularly, and a lot of development, and has allowed us to kind of draw on different fields and different metrics that already use network analysis and network theory to come up with kind of unique insights and different insights from what we've gathered from the latent variable approach. So really, it's not that other approaches are wrong, it's just that it's a different way of reconceptualizing the data to kind of draw more information. So some characteristics of MDD networks that we know from the extant literature so far kind of line up well with things that we already know. Individuals with MDD have higher negative affect on average, lower negative or lower positive affect, as well as greater emotional inertia, right? So we know that individuals with MDD typically have poor ability to self-regulate and bring their various emotions back down to baseline. And this concept of emotional inertia kind of captures that, where if I feel depressed, I'm going to feel more depressed because of my depression. And I have this ruminatory cycle that kind of begets greater and greater amounts of various negative affect variables. And kind of apropos to that, we also see greater network density in individuals with MDD. And so network density and emotional inertia are both kind of tied to this idea of emotional rigidity, right? So once I experience a negative emotion, say yesterday, I'm going to carry that forward into how I feel today. And it becomes more difficult to kind of break that cycle if my network is more dense. So I'm switching slides. I'm hoping this is showing. So on the left, we have like a really densely connected network. And on the right, we have a more loosely connected network across 3 time points. And so you can see, imagine if this, I hope I can highlight this, if this single node represents like my fatigue for the day, if my fatigue for today is highly dependent on my fatigue yesterday and the day before that, we can see that it gets really difficult for me to kind of disentangle that from my other emotional states and kind of come back down to baseline without changing kind of all of the other dependencies in the network structure. And so with individuals with MDD, we typically see greater network density on average, as well as higher emotional inertia, which is captured in like autoregressive effects. Some other effects that we see given individuals with MDD that seek treatment. Some research has found that in the dynamic network structures of individuals with MDD, they typically are less dense for individuals that will be more responsive to treatment, right? So from the very baseline network assessments, individuals who on average had less dense networks were more responsive to treatment later on. As well, we find that the actual structure itself, the emotion dynamics, don't seem to change with both medical intervention as well as behavioral intervention. So while the density, the strength of the connections between variables can change, with treatment, we don't see a lot of differences in the emotion dynamics, right? So they'll still stay connected, but maybe we can make those connections weaker. And so that sets up some kind of expectations that we know from the literature when we go into this kind of top-down and bottom-up view later on. So the way that a lot of these dynamic networks take place and are analyzed are through the VAR framework. I don't have a ton of time, so I can't really go into that. But basically, a VAR, you have variables at time predicted by variables at some previous time point, right? So in this case, say variable 1 is my depression. My depression today is predicted by my depression yesterday. If that effect is really strong, that'd be indicative of a high degree of inertia, right? There's a high degree of carryover from how I felt yesterday to how I'm feeling today. And so the VAR really is looking at kind of how the past is predicting the present time. The thing that makes a VAR graphical is that we're estimating this contemporaneous or same time effect, right? So is there an association between, say, my depression today and my fatigue today? And this is really helpful when we have, say, measurements taken once a day. It's likely that a lot of emotion dynamics take place on a shorter time scale than that. And so what we can do with the graphical VAR is kind of capture these effects, even if we haven't necessarily measured within that time scale. So it allows us to kind of get at smaller time scales. If we're willing to make some assumptions about our data, we can fit a chain graphical VAR, right? So basically, if we assume that all of our subjects come from a single population with some mean and standard deviation, we can kind of chain their time series together and get what's an average network of effects, right? So if I have a bunch of people with MDD, I can just stack their time series, fit one model, and get kind of the average emotion dynamics of a sample of individuals with MDD. But the problem comes when we have heterogeneity in our data, right? So maybe there are unique structures and unique characteristics that differentiate individuals that have one type of depression versus another type of depression. So this is like a simulated data set that I made up. We have two subgroups of people where variables 2 and 3 are opposite in polarity. And when we just ignore that heterogeneity and fit the model to the whole data set, we get nothing, right? The average of positive and negative is going to be 0. So the group level model can be kind of suspicious and misleading if we ignore that heterogeneity. I'm not going to go over this. If someone's interested, feel free to email me after the talk. But we came up with this approach for identifying subgroups using this approach. Basically, we find subgroups of individuals that share a lot of common structure in terms of the graphical VAR, and then we fit chain graphical VAR models to homogeneous subsets of individuals. So the data we have are taken from the MOVED study by Baumans et al. 2014, and as well as a follow-up by DeVos in 2017. They had 54 subjects. We removed 4 because of some convergence issues, but we had 50 subjects. 26 participants had MDD, and 24 were pair-matched controls. They were pair-matched on age, BMI, gender, and smoking behavior, and some personality characteristics. We imputed the missing data such that each person had 3 measurements per day for about a month. And they were assessed on 14 affect variables, 7 assessing positive emotions, as well as 7 assessing negative emotions. So we began by looking at kind of a top-down perspective. We split the data based off of the individuals who are in MDD and people who are in the control group. And we looked at their network models. And what you might notice is that they look almost exactly the same, right? There's very few differences in the connectivity networks of these individuals, as well as, I don't have this number with me, but I did calculate it. The network densities of these 2 individuals are very similar, right? And so this hopefully lines up well with the finding that I noted earlier, that the network density of individuals that are more responsive to treatment on average tends to be lower. And so we actually found that the network density for the individuals with major depressive disorder are more in line with individuals in the control group, as well as being really tight in their variability. And that kind of makes sense from how these individuals were sampled. I don't have that information, but essentially these individuals were in inpatient and outpatient facilities when they were recruited, so they were already actively getting treatment. And this study took place while they were continuing an ongoing treatment. So ideally, hopefully, this is indicative of kind of responsiveness to their treatment. Their connectivity and their density are more similar to those in the control group. But when we looked at kind of a exploratory analysis of how the structures matched up, we found that individuals with MDD were fairly homogeneous in their network structure, right? So a lot of the individuals in the MDD group had really similar network structures. So we can say that, what the heck happened here? We can say that individuals in the MDD group and this network that is kind of the average network is more reflective of kind of any random individual in the depressed group. But we saw a lot more heterogeneity in the control group, right? So there's a lot more heterogeneity in the kinds of network structures that you see in terms of controlled folks than you do with depressed folks. When we took a data-driven approach, we basically allowed our algorithm to kind of search the sample space, irrespective of whether an individual was MDD or not. And we tried to cluster individuals based off of commonalities of network structure. Now, based off of the past literature, we shouldn't expect a huge division based off of MDD and control groups based off of the network structure alone, because we've seen that there hasn't always been the case. And so when we took this data-driven approach, we found two major subgroups. We see this green group and this blue group that kind of emerged, and they're both amalgams of MDD folks as well as controlled folks. And these networks are, again, really similar, but we actually do see differences in the average network structures, right? So in this left group, the blue group, we see a lot more connectivity between these negative emotions and these positive emotions, right? I guess it's easier to contrast this with the green group, where depression is a very central node. It serves as kind of a gatekeeper between the negative emotions and the positive emotions for these individuals in the green group. So we can see that there are subtypes of individuals that experience different emotion dynamics, but these may not be associated with the clinical diagnoses, right? So there might be types of network structures that define affective dynamics, but the ways in which these connections work aren't necessarily indicative of whether you have MDD or not. It might be in the strength of those connections, as well as your receptivity to treatment. And that's kind of what this slide is. I always skip my conclusion slide because I sum it up at the end. But yeah, that's pretty much all of the findings that we have so far. And yeah, thank you. If anyone has questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think we have time for one question if there is one, but oh, we have one in the chat from Xiao. What is the community detection method you used?
We do a back and forth approach. We estimate the subgroups initially using walk-trap, but since walk-trap optimizes modularity, we found that that's not ideal in all cases. So we kind of find a kind of a seed of subgroups using walk-trap, and then we select from a bunch of different configurations of our adjacency matrix based off of a measure which maximizes conductance. So conductance is kind of the measure we're using, but walk-trap is the way that we're selecting the communities. Yeah, thank you.